Presidential Library. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our monthly Ford Evening Book Talk. I want to begin by thanking the Ford Motor Company who who fund this series for us and allow us to offer rich and engaging programming at no charge to the public. I also want to mention a couple of programs that we have coming up in the near future. Our annual Martha Washington Lecture is going to be taking place on June 13. The title is Women Waging War, and it's all about women's roles in the American Revolution. We still have both in-person and virtual tickets for sale on our website. And also our next book talk is going to be taking place on June 21, Alexandra Petrie's History, and this is with Washington Post columnist Alexandra Petrie. And so now to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Rachel Walker is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. She earned her BA in history from Ithaca College and both her MA and PhD in history from the University of Maryland. Her scholarship has been supported by numerous archives and institutions, including the Smithsonian's Museum National Portrait Gallery, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, and the American Antiquarian Society. Rachel was a member of the Washington Library's 2020-2021 class of research fellows, and she joins us tonight to discuss her new book, Beauty and the Brain, The Science of Human Nature in Early America. Rachel's going to be led in conversation tonight by someone who I'm very pleased to introduce. Dr. Patrick Sparrow was recently named as the new executive director of the Washington Presidential Library. He comes to us after serving as the librarian and director of library and museum of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. Dr. Sparrow earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and is the author of several books, including Frontier Country, The Politics of War in Early Pennsylvania, Frontier Rebels, The Fight for Independence in the American West, and Botany and Betrayal, Andre Michaud, Thomas Jefferson, and the Kentucky Conspiracy of 1793. Prior to his time at the American Philosophical Society, he served on the faculty of Williams College, teaching courses on the American presidency, the American Revolution, early American history, and political leadership. Please join me in welcoming both Dr. Rachel Walker and Dr. Patrick Sparrow.
Stephen. Thank you, Stephen, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm so glad that I could be here tonight. This was not planned, but a few days ago, Stephen mentioned that Rachel was here and asked if I wanted to read your book and have a conversation with you. And it was a great opportunity because I can't tell you how much I enjoyed your book. And I also want to congratulate you on a recent prize. Rachel just recently won the Murrin Prize for the best article published in Early American Studies, one of the premier journals. And it was based off this research, and my wife happens to be the managing editor of this journal, and I called her before this event, and I mentioned we were doing this, and she not only reminded me of that prize, but said not only was this the best article, but Rachel was the best author she's ever worked with.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I'm not making that up. I know we're being taped, you know, so.
Can you talk to my dean, maybe?
Yeah. No. Well, so I just want to jump into this book. You know, have a conversation about it, but also want to open it up to the audience too. But to begin, your book studies two phenomenon that many people here might not be familiar with. The first is called phrenology, and the second one I have a lot harder time saying. It's physiognomy.
Yes.
All right. So can you tell us what these were or are even?
Yeah, so I don't know if you've ever heard of these sciences, but these are two sciences that were enormously popular from probably the 1770s-ish up until probably the 1860s, but they continue in popularity. Physiognomy comes first. Physiognomy is a science that is rooted in the idea that you can tell someone's internal character simply by examining their facial features. So if I were to look at you and say like, wow, you look like a generous human being. Unfortunately, you look rather stingy and I don't think I would trust you. But it's also the idea, that the shape of your nose might indicate whether or not you were a good person to work with, or the size and shape of your forehead will indicate how intelligent you are. And so if I'm sure you've all heard the phrase highbrow, lowbrow, right? This actually comes from physiognomy, which is the idea that the higher your brow, the higher your forehead, the smarter you are. So we've now kind of lost the scientific history of that discipline, but we've hung on to some of the language that comes out of it. And then, so after physiognomy, phrenology comes after that. Phrenologists kind of take for granted the idea that the face reveals character, but they add on, they think the physiognomists are not being scientific enough. And so they're like, you can't just analyze the face. You also have to analyze the shape of the skull. So if you really want to analyze someone's brain, because the brain is the organ of the mind, and so if you really want to analyze their character and their personality, then what you have to do is you have to analyze the different parts of the brain. The phrenologists, we now think of it as a pseudoscience, but the phrenologists are actually some of the first people to argue for the theory of cerebral localization, which is just the idea that different parts of your brain do different things, which neuroscientists universally believe now. But the phrenologists also argued that you could then tell what different parts of the brain were doing by analyzing the shape of your skull. So they would argue, for instance, that they take from the physiognomist that your forehead indicates your character or your intelligence. But then the phrenologists also say that the brain is essentially divided into three big parts. So the front part of your brain is your intelligence. The top part of your brain is your moral and spiritual characteristics. So if you are particularly religious, you might have a really high dome of your head. And then the back of your brain is associated with your animal propensities. So that would be things like, will you be a good mother? Do you have a high sex drive? Do you like to eat a lot? Will you overeat, right? And are you destructive, right? Do you have like animalistic tendencies? So if you analyze the back part of the brain, that's your animalistic characteristics. The top part of your brain, your moral sentiments, as they put it, and the front of your head is your intellectual character. So yeah, these are sciences that are enormously popular for a really long time. They're in an era before we have psychology and neuroscience. These are psychology and neuroscience. And they spread from both elite intellectual circles and into popular culture as well. So it really kind of spans the divide between elite and working class and the masses generally.
Yeah, and one of the things I was struck by was how popular this really was. Can you tell us some stories about some of the people that were applying this, not just the scientists, but kind of the everyday people, or maybe even people we're familiar with, and how it influenced society?
Yeah, I mean, well, let's start with Washington. Washington himself was not a particularly big fan of physiognomy, but he corresponded with people who were. And so people were sending him. So there's this author, he's a Swiss reverend who really kind of makes physiognomy popular in the 1770s. And his name is Johann Caspar Lavender. And so he writes this 4-volume treatise on physiognomy. And so people are writing to George Washington's secretary and being like, hey, have you read the physiognomy? And he's like, so sorry, I don't really have time for that. Bye. So he is not a particularly engaged person with physiognomy, but people like John and Abigail Adams are. So John and Abigail Adams, for instance, write each other letters where they are analyzing the physiognomy of George Washington, or they are analyzing the physiognomy of Benjamin Franklin. And so they kind of read different things in their faces. In George Washington, they say, Abigail Adams says that he mixes the kind of martial spirit with, I think, like a domestic tendency, kind of like Republican virtue personified in his face. And she sees Benjamin Franklin as a kind of characteristic statesman and brilliant intellect. So they exchange these letters. They're kind of tongue in cheek, but also, I mean, they're analyzing what they see to be the characteristics of citizenship in the faces of the nation's founders.
And one of the stories, if I remember correctly, was that Lavender himself tried to analyze Washington from afar with a silhouette and created this problem for him. I don't know if you can share that with us.
Yes. Okay, so Lavender, think of Lavender as like who's a famous author today? I don't know, maybe like, J.K. Rowling, I don't know, someone, right? So he becomes kind of a bestseller in the general public. And so he's updating as the volumes start in German, and then they're translated into French, and then they're translated into English. And so as they're being translated, they're also being kind of changed, and they're adding additions. So after the American Revolution, they add information about both Washington and Benjamin Franklin, which is interesting because then Abigail Adams and John Adams are writing letters about the same two figures. But so he's like, well, we all know that George Washington is an excellent leader. He's incredible, like he's led the nation to victory. He's an excellent statesman. But Washington's face presents a bit of a problem for Lavender because he doesn't actually have the facial characteristics that Lavender associates with intelligence and greatness. So, for instance, Washington was pale and had light eyes. And paleness and light eyes tended to be associated with frivolity rather than kind of military excellence, right? And so Lavender is sitting there analyzing his face, and he's like, oh, yeah, and also I just told you the forehead is associated with intelligence, and Washington does not apparently have a particularly impressive forehead, according to Lavender. But Lavender is not analyzing Washington in person. He is analyzing an engraving of him. And so as Lavender is saying, he's like, yeah, the forehead leaves a bit to be desired, but I think it's the engraver's fault. Like they just didn't because we already know that Washington is great, right? So if we already know that Washington is great, then surely he has the facial features of greatness, And so it must be that whoever, copied the engraving just like didn't do it correctly.
Yeah. Well, that brings up one of the real questions I had about this book, which is, this is the moment of the Enlightenment when the scientific method is being applied. Famously, Benjamin Franklin, there was somebody in France named Mesmer who did this thing called animal magnetism, where he thought he could heal people through this, like the use of electrified air and other stuff.
And rods.
Yeah, right. And Franklin, famously, the French government said, let's test this. And Franklin did what is considered a real verification test, and he failed. And now here's this developing alongside it. So can you talk at all about how this got accepted? Did people test this, or was it just out there and accepted without any question?
Well, no, it's not accepted without question. So I've been talking mostly about physiognomy because that's the one that kind of like most applies to Washington. But as you move into the 19th century, the phrenologists say, the physiognomists it's not enough to just analyze facial features. Like we need to do it more scientifically. So they divide the brain into first 32 and then 35 and then 37 organs, and so they divide it into different parts. They're trying to do it scientifically. And so there are a lot of, there's this weird thing where you have people both who are like physicians and lawyers and society's elite, like people that we consider to be intellectuals who are embracing these sciences, but you have other people who think that they're kind of silly. And then you have a whole bunch of people who are kind of like skeptical but intrigued dabblers, so they're the people that are diehard believers. And then you have the people who are hardcore skeptics. And then you have this like whole array of people in the middle who are like, it seems to be some truth to that, right? But the thing is that like these sciences are not just either accepted or rejected. They're kind of like subtly moving into all of these arenas of life. So they're being used in like medical schools, for instance. So for instance, they use them in medical schools to identify the physical traits of mental illnesses. And yet they're also kind of influencing the language and literature. So it's pretty hard after about 1800 or so, it's pretty hard to pick up like any American novel and not see some sort of phrenological or physiognomical language in those novels. They're also filtering into popular culture. So there's this really kind of popular family called the Fowlers. And the Fowlers, they turn phrenology into a big business. And so in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, they open phrenological shops where you can go in and get your head read and like get your character. And then they start deploying a whole array of people who are like traveling through the nation, selling phrenological books and physiognomical books and reading people's heads on the road. So yeah, like it would be like a lecture like this, like a book talk, but like Orson Fowler. And then at the end of the book talk, which I will of course be doing later, is reading people's heads. But I mean, a similar situation, right? It's something like this where like, the educated and the refined would come out and hear a lecture on phrenology and then get their heads read. So it's filtering into popular culture. It's filtering into medical schools. It's filtering into the law. Like some people are using phrenological arguments to argue that like reasons why people are guilty or innocent in the courtroom, it's filtering into politics. So it just becomes, it's kind of understandable. Phrenology and physiognomy are they're captivating because they promise to reveal these hidden secrets about human nature. Like who doesn't want to go out into the world and know, can I trust this woman? I don't know, right? Yeah. Yeah. But it really kind of, it provides easy answers to things that are actually hard to discern. And it promises a form of self-knowledge, So like the idea that, oh, maybe I can actually know whether or not I'm going to be a good businessman or whether or not I'm going to be a good parent or whatever. So it ends up becoming massively popular even as people are skeptical of it.
If I remember right, John Brown Jr. was one of, can you tell his story? And this is the son of the famous John Brown.
Yeah, the famous John Brown who tries to spur an insurrection among the enslaved. His son was a phrenological lecturer. He works for this famous Fowler firm that I was just talking about. So he's traveling out throughout the West, and he's the one who is selling phrenological books and reading people's heads. Which is kind of interesting because like you would think these sciences are essentially rooted in the idea that your external body reveals your internal character. And you can probably see how a science like that is easily adopted by white supremacists or people who are pro-slavery to argue that people of color are inferior to white Americans. And they do that. There are pro-slavery writers who use these sciences to argue in favor of white supremacy. That said, actually, some of the most enthusiastic adopters of these sciences are people that we would consider kind of social radicals and progressive activists. So like people who are fighting against slavery, like John Brown Jr., and people who are fighting for women's rights. So the phrenologists, they end up becoming some of the most, they're fighting for female suffrage, like way in the 1840s and 50s, like way before most of the population is.
And African Americans themselves became practitioners of this
Indeed,
as well.
Yeah. So people like Frederick Douglass, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Frederick Douglass has a kind of complicated relationship with phrenology and physiognomy because he knows how white artists and scientists are using these sciences to mark Black Americans as inferior. So he knows, he's aware. That said, he also thinks that there's merit to the idea that one's face and head might indeed reveal your character. And he meets one of the world's most famous phrenologists, George Combe, in Scotland. And he puts him in the category, he's like, I think all white scientists, all white naturalists, all white phrenologists, for the most part, are racist, right? He doesn't say it in those terms, but he basically says, like, they're not going to take the idea of Black equality seriously. But he makes two exceptions. And one of the exceptions that he makes is one of the world's most famous phrenologists at the time. And so he sees phrenology as actually kind of a discipline that is not universally, unequivocally racist and can actually be used. He just argues like, well, it's just that white scientists are reading Black heads and faces incorrectly. And if we, as Black Americans, can find a way to read faces and heads in a more ethical way, then we can advocate for racial justice using these sciences. And that's in part why he becomes one of the most photographed man of the 19th century. Because he thinks he has a great face, and he does, right? Yeah.
So that's great. So what is the story of phrenology's fall? How does this extraordinarily popular science all of a sudden just kind of vanish?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it vanishes because it kind of maintains its presence kind of informally in popular culture much longer than it does. So by the 1860s, elite white male scientists are largely discarding phrenology as a science. But that doesn't mean it disappears. It's kind of still like I'm finding sources from 1890s where women are still using it. But this is the time period in the United States when you have the creation in like the 1850s and 60s. You have the creation of the American Medical Association, and you have increasingly scientists arguing that like we are different and better than other thinkers, and we need to institutionalize our field, and we need to prove like how we are different and better than other people. Before, the 1840s, 50s, 60s, science is just kind of this like eclectic enterprise that people in like you're not, to be a doctor, you're not required to go to medical school, right? You're not required to have any particular sort of credential. You can kind of just, like everyone can kind of take part in it. It's a much more open scientific universe at that point. But that's beginning to change in the 1850s and 60s. And that's precisely the moment when like elite white male intellectuals begin arguing like, okay, phrenology is bunk, we're going to make it better. Mm. That said, the sciences that they embrace instead are not any more scientific than phrenology. It's not like this narrative of scientific progress because phrenology, at least the phrenologists argued for the theory of cerebral localization, which is like different parts of the brain do different things. The scientists that discard phrenology after that, they're like, no, that's too complicated. We're just going to measure the size of skulls. And so like, they begin taking disembodied skulls and just filling them with various substances. And the more like they fill them with like dirt or lead shot or whatever. And the more you can fit, the bigger the brain, which means the smarter you are. And they keep meticulous records, right? So they view it as more mathematical and more serious than the phrenologists. But that's actually more problematic than the phrenological theory that came before it. So it's not like they're getting more scientific, but they are rejecting phrenology.
Yeah. And one of the other choices you made, and you talk about it, and I don't know if you can share some of your thinking with us, is you chose not to call phrenology a pseudoscience, which it often has been, but you really embrace it as a science. Can you talk a little bit more about that decision?
Yeah, you guys are probably listening to this and thinking like, obviously that science is not a legitimate science. And I should be clear that I don't like think that you can actually tell someone's character by analyzing their face. Like I don't think that. That said, I don't use the word pseudoscience because at the time it was not considered a pseudoscience. It was considered a real science. And that's not to say that it was unchallenged. Like there were people who didn't believe in it, but that's true of any scientific theory, including evolution today, right? And so one of the kind of big premises of my book is that like, if you actually want to understand the cultural and mental universe of the people that you're studying, you can't just kind of walk in with your big ego and be like, haha, like I am so much smarter and better than those people in the past. How did they not know that this isn't a legitimate science? I think using a word like pseudoscience is a way of making yourself feel superior, but it's not actually a way of understanding the worldview of the people you're trying to study. So I think you have to really take these sciences seriously as sciences because that's how the people you're studying are approaching them. So yeah, I don't use the word pseudoscience in this book.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about its legacy, both in the culture, but also in science? I mean, you hit on it a little bit, but if you were to say, what did phrenology or physiognomy have any lasting impact or shape the way history evolved?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess we started with this idea, the language of highbrow, lowbrow, right? We basically kept the entire meaning of it. When we say that someone is highbrow, we refer to them as fancy and refined and cultivated. And when they're lowbrow, they're kind of a cultural Philistine of a sort, right? So there's language that sticks around. And even if you're reading literature of today, notice now, like I was reading a Margaret Atwood novel and she's describing a character as intellectually sophisticated and she says that they have a high forehead, so pay attention to the physical language that people use to describe characters. A lot of it is, and I don't think these authors know exactly what they're engaging with. They're engaging with a literary history, but that literary history is shaped by physiognomy and phrenology. In terms of science, I think physiognomy and phrenology, we just talked about how elite scientists begin rejecting it in the 1850s and 60s, but they don't reject the fundamental premise of physiognomy and phrenology. And that fundamental premise is that your external body reveals something important about your internal character. They take that premise and they continue it. They just say like, okay, well, it's not scientific enough. We need more numbers. We need to measure the body in different ways. So they begin, as I said, like measuring skulls. But even the anthropology emerges as a field in the late 19th century, and they are obsessed with measuring people's bodies. They measure the length of your arms. They measure every single bone. They measure skull size. They measure skull shape. They measure facial width to height ratios, which data scientists are still doing today. So the idea that you can somehow determine how smart, how beautiful, how virtuous people are just by analyzing their bodies, that does not disappear. It's just like the idea that you can analyze the skull bumps, that disappears. But they just find other ways to do it.
That's great. And one of the things that I mean, you made me worried about a lot of things I thought I knew, which is how this influences art.
Yeah.
You had an image of Daniel Webster and you connected it to, here's the description of Daniel Webster, here's a portrait that seems to confirm these ideas we have about their personality. And Margaret Fuller, where you had a daguerreotype. So you have this photographic evidence versus
how they drew her.
Yeah. So, I mean, as a historian, what should I be thinking about all these works of art that I look at and how to read them myself?
Well, I mean, we all art historians have been talking forever about how, you know, artists are sometimes giving a sort of idealized finish to their sitters because they're the ones paying you, right? So of course you're gonna paint them as more beautiful, whatever. But so I actually have, and I didn't use a lot of this evidence in my book, but I spent a long time looking at it at the National Portrait Gallery. There's this sculptor, in the 19th century, Hiram Powers, who is like one of the most famous sculptors in the 19th century. And he's also a hardcore phrenologist. And so he is having his letters that he writes back and forth with clients. It's a really excellent source base because he's working out of Italy because that's where all the good marble is. So he's working out of Italy. So as a result, all of his clients are in the United States for the most part. So there's lots of letters about how clients want to be portrayed. And he's using phrenological language and being like, don't worry, I'll make your forehead, you'll have an intellectual forehead. I'll style your hair in a way that emphasizes the right, phrenological endowments. So yeah, like people are not just painting to make their sitters look better. Well, yeah, they're painting to make their sitters look better, but what is considered better is shaped by the phrenological and physiognomical standards of the day.
It puts a whole different idea on self-representation because we know oftentimes in portraits people will choose a particular pose and make sure they're surrounded by certain imagery that is projecting something, but it's also their face. They're thinking, how is this going to look, and working with the artists themselves. And Charles Wilson Peale opened the first successful museum in the United States, and you talk about one of the reasons he did it. And I don't know if you can share more with us.
Yeah. So he opens this museum, and so in this museum, it's a natural history museum, but he also conveys the portraits of all of these revolutionary leaders and statesmen and early politicians. And his thought is that the public is going to be able to go into this museum and see the faces of all of these great men and like quite literally see the virtue and intelligence just like radiating off of their faces. And like by looking at these people, the public is going to somehow imbibe the moral and mental characteristics that the public has. But Charles Wilson Peale, which is interesting, I think in art history circles, he's kind of known as someone who paints most faces the same. Like he has that kind of classic oval. But that's not how he thought about what he was doing. That was probably his technique, right? But how he thought about what he was doing was like, he has a quote, I can't remember if I included it or not, but he has a quote. He's like, if I can't portray the character of a man in a portrait, then I don't want to paint him. Like the only real goal of portraiture is to convey character. So yeah, that's an assumption that I think has carried on. Yeah. And that a lot of art historians kind of take for granted when studying portraiture.
And yet one of the other kind of interesting, I try to wrap my head around it, and I'd love to hear you talk more about it, is we often think about our head as maybe formed as it is. My head is not going to change after a certain point.
Yeah.
But that's not what phrenologists thought. There was this idea that you could, through work, evolve your skull. I mean, can you talk more about this?
Yeah. If you want to be more attractive, all you have to do is like work on your brain, and then you can kind of quite literally change your skull. So phrenologists believe, and physiognomists also believe,
I don't say physiognomy because it's harder to say.
Yeah. So they believe that if you want to be more attractive, then you can't and you shouldn't just change your external appearance. Because the only way to really be more beautiful is to work on your moral and mental character. And then as you work on your moral and mental character, you're going to be solidifying the parts of your brain that are associated with the good character traits that you're developing. So if you read a lot and like do a lot of crossword puzzles or play the piano or whatever, then all the parts of your brain associated with intelligence and musical skill, your brain is going to grow, and as it grows, it's going to push on your skull from the inside out and literally change the shape of your head. And so phrenologists argue that anyone can be smarter and more attractive and more beautiful. And they kind of believe that it's like easier to do when you're a kid. But they're like, don't worry, there's hope for adults too. Like you can not only change your mind, you can also change your body. Yeah.
Fascinating. So the whole time I was reading this, I was wondering, how did you come to this topic?
Actually, honestly, by accident, a very happy accident though. So I have always been, I started grad school as a historian of, gender and sexuality in the body. And there's a kind of truism in that field that scientific understandings of the body, of the gendered body in particular, really begin to shift at the end of the 18th century, so late 1700s. And so there's this idea that like previously up until that point, people viewed male and female bodies as essentially the same. Like women's bodies were just men's bodies turned inside out, so like women were just inferior versions of men with their genitalia like shoved up in their bodies as opposed to like hanging out on the outside. And so there's a lot, anyway, this is like a long weird way of saying there's a lot of scholarship on skeletons and genitals in the field of like history of science and the body. But all that scholarship primarily focuses on medical textbooks and like what people are learning in medical schools and what like elite, intellectual treatises and stuff like that. And so I'm like, it seems very clear to me that there is a fundamental shift in how people describe bodies at that moment. But my question was always okay, so like that's what's happening in elite scientific circles. Like what is happening on the ground? When people just walk out into the world, how are they making sense of the gendered body? Like how am I actually seeing gender in a real meaningful, practical way, on the ground? And so I was trying to just find anything that would help me get at that question. Initially, I started a project on capital punishment because I was like, where do people talk about bodies? Like when they're talking about punishing bodies, So I was looking at a lot of court records, but I just kind of accidentally started finding all of these references to heads and faces in the archives. I'm like, why are people obsessed with noses? Why are people obsessed with, foreheads? Why do I just keep seeing this over and over? And then I read a really good book by Christopher Lukasik, who also wrote a book on physiognomy. He's a literary scholar. And I was like, oh, this is what it is. And then the rest is kind of history. I just started digging from there.
Yeah, well, the digging is the other part that I was struck by, because how did you find all of this material? In some ways, it often felt like you must have been on a needle in a haystack search.
You might think that, but when you realize how popular these sciences were, you realize that you start just seeing them kind of accidentally everywhere in the archives. Because you're right, like I use a bunch of different sources. I do use court records in this book. So in the courts, in prisons, they had in the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, they had what's called a moral instructor who would go in and like lecture the prisoners about how they're bad people and they need to reform and they need to find baby Jesus and like all of these things. But he was also a phrenological enthusiast. And so as he's in there talking to prisoners, he's also analyzing their heads and faces and trying to figure out like if they're capable of reform or not. So, once I find the records, I'm realizing I'm like, oh, wow, they're everywhere. And I'm like, I wonder if they're doing it in Boston. And, sure enough, they're doing it in Boston too. Or, you find it in newspapers. You see, so you just type in, digital databases, you can start typing in things like intellectual forehead or like high brow or, things like that. And they start coming up everywhere. And then you're like, I wonder if people are talking about this in their diaries and letters. And so, you find ways to search and sure enough, because it's so prevalent, you find it, everywhere.
Yeah.
Not everywhere, but it was actually easier than you might think to find in the archives.
Yeah, and I'd love to ask people about how their own thinking changes through the work that they do. Yeah, you started this project, and now we know you started down a very different path.
Yeah.
You kind of went down the phrenology and physiognomy path. How did your thinking change as you were going through these archives? Did you have assumptions that you began with that you discarded, or just think totally differently than you started when you started the project on the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of knew a little bit about phrenology. I didn't know much about physiognomy, but I did know about phrenology. And of course, the first assumption that you have, and one that's really prevalent in the literature, is that especially in the history of science, scholars have been really good in the past few decades at showing how science can be a weapon of oppression. And so I knew about scientific racism, I knew about phrenology, I knew about craniometry. And so what I was thinking, I was like, all right, this is a story about power and the body and how scientists use empiricism to discriminate against white women, people of color, indigenous people, a broad variety of people who are marginalized by the broader society. And then I started finding, I'm like, okay, great. But then, like, why is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's like an advocate of women's rights, embracing this science? Why is Frederick Douglass using it? Why are all these other Black thinkers using it? Wait a second. These people who are phrenologists are supporting female suffrage. They're supporting abolition. Like, wait, John Brown's kid is a phrenologist? And so I think the most surprising thing that I found was all of these social radicals or otherwise marginalized people who actually see these sciences and don't see science as a weapon of oppression and instead see it as this kind of exciting tool that they can use to advocate for equality. And so that's when I realized, I was like, oh, okay, there's something interesting to say here. It's not just a story, like the familiar story about science being used to discriminate.
Yeah. And stories is actually, you tell so many great stories in here and you have so much great evidence. I don't know if you could share with us what your favorite story is that we haven't talked about yet.
Oh,
Can
I tell you one from that's not in the book?
Oh yeah,
that's
that'd be
like
great.
Increasingly.
Yeah.
So I didn't put this in the book because I couldn't figure out where to fit it, but it's going to be in a book chapter that I have coming out soon. So there's a woman, Carolyn Healy Dahl, who is a transcendentalist intellectual, and she goes to the dentist, which in the 19th century is like a horrifying prospect. Every time there's there is one thing that two things that I really hate in the archives: finding people's hair. Especially when it's unexpected. Like, unexpected hair in the archives is one of the worst things in the world. The other horrifying thing in the archives is reading about people writing about their experiences going to the dentist in a world before anesthesia and like modern medical technology. And people write about going to the dentist a lot. They're shockingly nonchalant. They're like, had 4 teeth pulled today. I'm like, why? Anyways, I'm like off on a weird tangent. But so this woman, she goes to the dentist. And as she goes to the dentist, he's, rooting around in her mouth, pulling her teeth. And he starts, as he's pulling her teeth, analyzing her head and like telling her really offensive things about her character. He's just like, yeah, clearly you're really smart. You've got a great forehead, but I don't think you'll ever be as great as your dad. Like he's you're really smart, but you don't really have any mathematical genius at all. And I think like, even though you have smartness, you don't have determination. So I don't think you're going to be able to succeed. And he's like telling her all these things. But in the source, it's wild because she's not really offended. Like she's one of those people that I would call like a skeptical dabbler in phrenology. She doesn't really trust it. But she goes home after the dentist and she's writing in her diary and she's like, oh yeah. And she basically recounts all of the things that he says about her character. And she's like, he said that I have no mathematical genius. He's wrong. I do. Like, and so she's kind of like refuting the various points. But it's interesting to me because she doesn't really trust phrenology, but she's so fluent in the language that she knows how to do it. And then she's like, it's a good thing that he didn't analyze my organ of amativeness, which is your libido, basically. She's like, I would have been embarrassed if he had done that, which of course, like your dentist, I would have been embarrassed. But then she starts telling a story. She's like, yeah, well, like one of my friends, her best friend is more into phrenology than she is. And she wants her to go get her head examined. And she's like, yeah, I don't want to do that. And her friend's like, well, why? Are you embarrassed? Are you afraid that like he's going to reveal your large organ of amativeness in front of a whole audience? Yeah. And she's like, I'm not embarrassed. Like, I think I have a great head, whatever. But she's like, but that did happen to one of my friends. So it's interesting. So it's like people, even when they're not really buying in, they're still aware of it. They know how to speak the language. They know how to analyze their own skulls. And they're kind of just expecting that they're going to be moving through the world and other people are going to be analyzing their skulls.
Yeah, that's great. So being at George Washington's Presidential Library, you always have to bring it back to Washington somehow. And one of the other figures that emerges in your story is Mason Weems, who's
Oh,
famous
yeah.
for, the cherry tree
Yes.
lie. You want to share with us how he engaged with phrenology?
Yeah.
Or his
So
physiognomy, I guess.
physiognomy, yeah. So that's a kind of phrenology doesn't really emerge until like the late 1790s, and it doesn't really start spreading, especially to the United States, until like the 1820s. But physiognomy. So Mason Locke Weems, he writes this. This was actually one of the first sources that I encountered in the archives. He writes this little pamphlet about this charming woman called Delia D, who was the ideal Republican wife. And he starts the whole thing by saying, like, you should never analyze a book by its cover. You should never analyze a woman by her beauty alone, because beauty is not important. And if you want a really good wife, you should be looking for good things like character traits and what's on the inside. And you can tell if a woman has good character traits by analyzing all of her facial features. So so don't look at a woman's beauty. You should look at a woman's mind. And you can tell how good her mind is by analyzing her face. So he gives these really detailed descriptions of exactly what Delia D looks like and how her forehead looks and how her eyes look. And then I started digging further, and it turns out he plagiarized a lot of that language from Lavender. So he's actually taking a lot of his language from a physiognomical treatise and using it to describe what the ideal Republican woman might be. So he's telling lies not only about George Washington, but also about poor Delia, who I don't think.
That's great, and I think we haven't done justice to your book, which makes so many important points. And I think what we've seen tonight is that this is, it might be a quirky part of history, but it gets us engaged. And you make a lot of really important points about how this science provides us a window into 19th century life, American life. So when everybody goes home tonight and tells their friends about this talk they heard about, can you believe what they were doing in the 19th century with heads, what else do you want people to tell their friends about phrenology and why it matters?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing that I would say is that it might make you feel good to denounce phrenology and physiognomy as these kind of like quirky forms of quackery that, can you believe how stupid people were in the past? But I would urge you to actually think about these as one scholar put it, a scholar, Britt Russert, she used the phrase legitimate knowledge systems. These sciences are really sciences at the time that people take seriously. And so I'd urge you to think, like, what do we believe now that might be discredited in 50 years? Do you need to be dismissive and call them quirky pseudosciences? Or do you maybe need to take a moment of intellectual humility and be like, you know what, maybe a lot of the things that I think about the world now will be discredited soon. And I should just try to understand people for who they are and what they believe in, and take them seriously and take their worldview seriously. The second thing that I would say, which we didn't really get a huge chance to talk about, but I think the second important thing about this book is, I'm saying my own book's important. The thing that I find important, the thing that I find important is that science can often be a weapon of oppression that powerful people use to discriminate against the marginalized, and they definitely use these sciences to do that. That said, science can also be a tool that marginalized people and advocates for social justice can take and reframe and reshape and adopt and co-opt and use for their own purposes. And so this book is full of stories of people that you might think, like, why would that person embrace physiognomy and phrenology? And you kind of see how they do it and how they use science to advocate for equality. So I guess that's the two things that I would say is, like, take these sciences seriously, not because they're legitimate ways of analyzing character, but because people used to think they were. And also, don't always assume that that it's going to be a discriminatory or bad thing, because sometimes people are using it in creative and generative ways.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think we have time for questions.
Great presentation. Thank you. You touched on this briefly, but can you talk a little more about how journalists portrayed the sciences, particularly in the late 18th century and well into the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, journalists are some of the major people who are spreading these sciences throughout the general public. So a lot of historians of science, particularly historians of science and gender, argue that the primary way that scientific knowledge is hitting the masses in the 19th century is not in scientific textbooks and not in school, but through periodicals, through newspapers, through magazines, through things like this. So journalists, I mean, I think the political journalists are particularly cool. They're going into Congress and analyzing, the heads and faces of the people who are senators and representatives. Or during a presidential election, you can open the pages of a national newspaper and see phrenological profiles of all the major candidates for office to see, like who. So they argue that Jackson, for instance, has a large organ of destructiveness, which, not wrong, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, journalists are using it to analyze political figures. They're also using it to analyze intellectuals, people like George Washington, people like Ben Franklin. And so it's really in these newspapers and magazines that this knowledge is spreading throughout the general public. Yeah.
You had said that Ben Franklin was analyzed, but he was a scientist himself. What did he think of the science?
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin, I've not been able to find any evidence that he himself is super engaged in physiognomy and, phrenology. He kind of dies before phrenology becomes popular. So Benjamin Franklin, he doesn't write extensively as far as I've been able to find about this science, and it doesn't seem like he's a major adopter. That said, Benjamin Rush, who is one of his contemporaries, is writing about the character implications of facial features. So it's like, this is kind of what I'm saying, where it's like, George Washington doesn't particularly embrace physiognomy, but John Adams does, and like Benjamin Franklin doesn't, but Benjamin Rush does. So it's not universally accepted among everyone, but certain figures are taking it and kind of running with it within the broader society.
I wonder if there's some self-interest, because if I remember correctly, Benjamin Rush was known to have a really large head, which they associate with intelligence, and so he was, of course, on board with physiognomy.
Although the physiognomists loved Benjamin Franklin, even if he didn't love them.
Yeah.
So he got a lot of, Benjamin Franklin got more positive portrayals than Benjamin Rush did.
Well, without having had the pleasure of reading your book, my question would be this. I'm getting the impression that this was just like this wave sweeping across the country. Who were the forces that were actually aligned against it and trying to say, no, this is wrong, this is not right, it's not accurate?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a question that I asked myself a lot as I was doing my research, because as a historian, you kind of want to put people into camps, right? Because it adds, you're looking at this messy historical landscape and you want to impose some sort of analytical clarity upon it, because like that's our job. We got to tell stories, we got to craft narratives, we have to put together camps of people. And every time I tried to do it, it was like really, really hard. It's like there are certainly people who don't buy into it, but they don't all fall within it's not like, well, all the doctors are opposed to it, or all the lawyers are opposed to it, or all of the conservatives are opposed to it. I would say that people who tend to be more socially conservative are actually the bigger opponents of physiognomy and phrenology, which was something surprising for me, because I think of it as like, these sciences are problematic and they're used by powerful people to discriminate against others. But it's actually the people who are like fighting for justice that are kind of embracing them. But it's hard to put people in camps because ultimately it's kind of like an individual decision. And I was unable to really come up with any sort of analytical framework that made that make sense to me. Yeah.
Go ahead. Well, anyway, does the fact that we have nowadays we study body language and supposedly you can tell when someone is lying if they look off to a certain direction or something, do those things have any relationship to all that, the study that you looked into?
Yeah. So interestingly, people have been doing that, forever. Trying to read people, right? We're human beings. We're social animals. We go through the world. We try to read people. But interestingly, Lavender, when he comes up with his scientific physiognomical system, he distinguishes between reading facial expressions like that, and which he calls pathognomy, and physiognomy. And he argues that like pathognomy is useful and important because it allows you to read, what's going through a person's mind at a particular moment. But physiognomy is a science, whereas pathognomy is an art, because the face moves. But physiognomy is a science because you're analyzing the permanent structures of people's faces. So that said, people will often be analyzing facial expressions, which is technically not physiognomy, but refer to their own behavior as physiognomy. So the answer is like these sciences are so complex, and there's not clear rules. And so people are just like taking what they want and cherry picking and adopting whatever they want and using them all together in kind of this like giant messy melange of character detection. But yeah, that stretches back. And even like physiognomy today, lots of data scientists are doing studies where they measure what's called the facial width to height ratio. And they do studies of like hockey players, and they try to study like the most aggressive hockey players. Do they have wider heads? And there's like all these statistical analyses that are done. I'm like, that is just the phrenological organ of destructiveness, which is like seen here. And so I'm like, are we just taking these old ideas and applying them to modern research and refusing to let go of them? Like, is physiognomy and phrenology, like, are those sciences just not dying and kind of refusing to go away? So the answer is like, yeah, people have been doing it for centuries and they're continuing to do it today.
Well, can I ask you about that? How do you
Yeah.
feel about?
Feel really weird about it. I mean, there was another study too that came out around the time that I was finishing my dissertation, where it was a data scientist who went and downloaded a bunch of pictures from people's dating profiles, and then marked you as gay or straight, depending on if you like said you were looking for men or women, and then used facial recognition software to try and come up with like the gay face versus the straight face, and see if like the computer could detect who was gay and who was straight just by like analyzing. Like basically it's like the same thing as the Physiognomic Project, but just using computers now. And I mean, I have so many problems with that for lots of other kind of like theoretical reasons that are like rooted in postmodernism and all these things that I won't talk about. But like what, how do you know like what is gay and what is straight? But I feel troubled by the idea that like we just keep trying to find better ways to read people's bodies. And I'm like, why are we so obsessed with reading people's bodies when we could just treat people as equal humans? Like, why do we need to tell if someone, like, why do you need to analyze someone's face in order to tell?
Actually, that brings up another question, which is, did Lavender just come up with this idea out of thin air, or was there even like a history?
No. There's like a physiognomic tradition that stretches back, hundreds of years. At least to the ancient Greeks, like, so there's all these physiognomical analyses of Socrates, for instance, where he apparently had like a very ugly face. And so they're like, oh, well, he can't be virtuous. And then like the physiognomists come up with this whole story about how like, well, he was bad as a young person, but he got better as older. But like when he was bad as a young person, it imprinted on his face, and thus he was ugly for the rest of his life. And so, but yeah, anyway, stretches back to at least the ancient Greeks. There's a tradition of it in East Asian countries too. So the idea that you can read a person's character on their face is actually a pretty old one. Lavender just changes it by saying like, actually, we can come up with rules. We can do it with almost mathematical certainty. Like this can be a real science. And it's kind of like an enlightenment project. It's like, let's just like take this thing that's long existed and make it more scientific.
I have to say, I felt awful for Margaret Fuller.
I know, poor Margaret Fuller. Yeah.
I'll have to read the book to know why. I think there was another question in the back.
Well, this by chance kind of dovetails into what you've just said. In about the mid-90s, my wife was involved in this kind of a thing. It turns out there's 32 faces, eigenfaces. If you superimpose those in different proportions, in theory, you can reproduce anybody's face on the planet, which is great for artificial intelligence oppressing the world. My question is just how quantitative do people try to make phrenology? Is there any kind of a notion that here's the standard head and we can quantify the departures from that quote perfect head?
Yeah, so one of the physiognomical ideas is that you can tell how smart someone is by measuring their facial angle. And so a facial angle is like if you were to take a line and draw it from your forehead down through your lips, like a straight line, and then draw another line from your ear to your nose. So you have like 2 lines here, and you can measure the angle. The closer you are to 90 degrees, the more intelligent you are. And the lower your facial angle, so like if you're like a 75-degree facial angle, then that supposedly means that you're not intelligent. So people quantify it that way. They later on in the 19th century, they come up with various, like facial indexes. They measure facial width to height. They compare it. They start filling skulls, so they quantify it that way. Physiognomists and phrenologists, though, are largely kind of resistant to quantification. The kind of analysis rests in the eye of the observer. And they argue like you can't just measure one thing about a face. You got to like take it in as a whole, in order to kind of see it, which is why people are able to say that they're not scientific. And they're like, what you really need to do is fill a skull with lead shot. Like that's how you really be scientific and empirical, which like works in the 19th century. So their physiognomists and phrenologists are kind of like the loosey-goosey facial analyzers. Like you got to take in the whole picture. But people, okay. Francis Galton. Anyone know Francis Galton? He's Darwin's cousin. He comes up with like the modern idea of IQ, basically, like the idea that like intelligence can be measured. And he is obsessed with faces. He does the superimposition of faces in order to come up with like the musical genius. So he'll like, he does like the composite faces. Like this is what a musical genius looks like. This is what a criminal looks like. This is what like a genius looks like. So he's obsessed with like figuring out like what do all smart people share, like what do all smart people's faces look like maybe if I take a bunch of smart people and just like superimpose the images, I can come up with like the smart face. So yeah, it just keeps kind of like reappearing in different places in different ways.
See a lot more hands. There's one up here.
So my question is, we look like our parents.
Yeah.
So I, for instance, am almost the image of my father. And so
You must be a very attractive man.
Thank you. So was there any theory that if you read this in your parent, that the same characteristics would be in the child?
Indeed, there was phrenological matchmaking where you could write into a phrenological journal with your phrenological proportions and say like, I am a person with like large destructiveness, but also large intellectual faculties. And I'm looking for a wife with large domestic faculties and a big organ of philoprogenitiveness. And like, here are my positive traits, here are my negative traits. There are also treatises written about like what the good mix of phrenological characteristics are. So if you want to have healthy offspring, they're actually kind of, this is eugenics before eugenics exists formally as a field. The phrenologists are kind of advocating for eugenics. They're publishing these treatises that's like, you need healthy stock. You need, if you want to have strong and intelligent children, then you have to match with the correct person. Like if you have these traits, they shouldn't be mixed with these traits, but they might be okay with these traits. And no one's perfect, but maybe like this is the best combination. So their whole books about like how to find a phrenological match. And you can even write into the phrenological journal and find your cranial companion. Yeah.
You had spoken about the sculptor designing the sculpture to show off the features.
Yep.
Did you find any evidence that hairstyles or accessories, hats were either designed or advertised to emphasize certain features?
Yeah, in fact, I became obsessed with this for like a solid year. So my 4th chapter is almost entirely about hairstyles. It's about like hairstyles and women's rights. So I don't know if you guys know, if you look at portraits from the 1830s and 40s, there's that, yeah, Samantha's doing it in the back. There's this style that I think is very unflattering, but if you really like it, then I'm sure that's good for you. But if you part your hair right down the center and just kind of like slick it to your head and kind of tie it in a bun in the back, this becomes a very popular hairstyle, like in American Gothic, the kind of bun in the back. So this becomes a very popular hairstyle precisely at the moment when phrenology is most popular. And so I was like, I wonder if there's any, like if this is a coincidence. And so I started finding in newspapers and magazines all of these men who are complaining about intellectual women who are styling their hair in unflattering ways in order to show off their cranial bumps. And then I start looking in beauty manuals. I'm like, is anyone actually instructing women to do this? And the beauty manuals are, in fact, instructing women to part their hair in the center and do a simple hairstyle so that you can more effectively, see the cranial contours of your head. And then I start seeing all this complaining that women are shaving the tops of their forehead in order to look smarter. And then I'm like, that can't actually be happening. And so I start looking in newspapers and I see all of these advertisements for what they call depilatory powders, which are powders to remove the hair. They're like, you can use them to remove the hair on your hairy moles or the hair at the top of your forehead to reveal your intellectual forehead. And they cite in these newspaper advertisements, they cite Johann Caspar Lavender and Spurzheim, who was a phrenologist at the time. They're like, you too could reveal your intellectual beauteous forehead to the world. So yeah, like it's influence. I'm like, it's in court records. It's in, beauty manuals. It's everywhere. Like once you start looking for it, you're like, wow, this is actually everywhere. It's like a whole worldview that's shaping how people see themselves and others. Yeah.
Last question.
So, excuse me, you've been talking about the head and the brain, but as you were talking, I remembered a couple of other characteristics that theoretically indicate something, but it's, below the neck. So for instance, I have heard that people whose second toe is longer than their first toe are more intelligent.
Oh, wow.
And I've also heard, I'm sure everybody's heard the term birthing hips.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So is there a below the neck equivalent to what you studied?
Yeah, I mean, phrenologists are actually arguing for the idea of birthing hips like way back in the 1830s. There's an image that I sometimes use, like in book talks where I actually kind of present a more formal PowerPoint. The phrenologists, they are primarily concerned with the head and brain, but they're also concerned with the body generally. And so they will print images of like the ideal female form. And they explicitly say, like, in women, if your shoulders are broader than your hips, then you're going to be a deficient mother. And then they'll say something like, and you can probably tell by the small organ of philoprogenitiveness on the back of the head, So the phrenologists are not actually just concerned with the head and face. They're actually concerned with the body more generally. But they're reading all of these kind of European scientific treatises that are making this argument. People become obsessed with the birthing hips idea so that was like the idea that I knew. But when I started this research, I'm like, okay, everyone's talking about skeletons, right? Everyone's talking about below the belt. But like, I'm like, what's happening above the shoulders, right? But yeah, all these ideas are kind of mingling together and coexisting within the same intellectual sphere. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
It is, as I think you all could tell tonight, a really fascinating story or series of stories you tell in this book, which is available for sale outside this door, correct?
Rachel will be available.
Will you be signing? And she will be signing them. Yeah. So great. Thank you again, Rachel.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you.